The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Tampico as 9 American sailors from the USS Dolphin stepped onto Mexican soil on April 9, 1914. What began as a routine supply run for gasoline would spiral into an international crisis that would forever alter the relationship between 2 neighboring nations. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Long led his men through the bustling port city, unaware that Mexican federal forces had declared martial law just hours earlier. The tension in the air was palpable. Revolutionary forces loyal to Venustiano Carranza were advancing on the city, and General Victoriano Huerta's Federals were on edge, suspicious of any foreign presence that might aid their enemies. As the American sailors loaded fuel cans onto their whaleboat near the Iturbide Bridge, a Mexican patrol suddenly surrounded them. Colonel Ramon Hinojosa, commanding the federal garrison, had given strict orders to arrest anyone who might be supplying the rebels. The Americans' protestations fell on deaf ears as they were marched through the streets at gunpoint, their white naval uniforms drawing curious stares from the local population. The arrest lasted only 90 minutes, but those fateful moments would reverberate across the hemisphere. Admiral Henry Mayo, commanding the American naval forces in Mexican waters, was incensed when he received word of the incident. The gruff-mustached admiral had spent decades protecting American interests in troubled waters, and he viewed this affront to the American flag as intolerable. According to contemporary reports from the New York Times, Mayo immediately dispatched a strongly worded message to General Ignacio Morelos Zaragoza, military commander of Tampico, demanding not only a formal apology, but also a 21-gun salute to the American flag. The demand was unprecedented in its boldness. The sovereign nation had been asked to salute another's flag as an act of contrition. President Woodrow Wilson, already grappling with the complex situation in Mexico following the assassination of President Francisco Madero the previous year, found himself caught between diplomatic protocol and national honor. The scholarly president, who had initially hoped to avoid military intervention in Mexico, now faced mounting pressure from Congress and the American public to take decisive action. General Huerta, the iron-fisted dictator who had seized power in Mexico City, was equally defiant. Though he agreed to apologize for the arrest, he steadfastly refused to order the ceremonial salute. Mexico, he declared through his representatives, does not salute the flag of any nation that does not reciprocate the honor. As April progressed, the diplomatic crisis deepened. Wilson ordered additional naval vessels to Mexican waters, including the powerful battleships USS Utah and USS Florida. The president's advisors were divided. Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan urged caution, while younger officials pushed for military action to protect American dignity. The situation reached a boiling point when American intelligence reported that a German merchant vessel, the Ipiranga, was steaming toward Veracruz, carrying a massive shipment of arms and ammunition intended for Huerta's forces. Wilson realized that allowing these weapons to reach the Mexican government would significantly strengthen America's adversary and potentially prolong the civil war that was devastating Mexico. On April 20, 1914, Wilson appeared before a joint session of Congress, his face grave as he outlined the escalating crisis. The chamber fell silent as the president requested authorization to use military force to obtain recognition of American rights in Mexico. The die was cast within hours. American warships were steaming at full speed toward the ancient port city of Veracruz, their guns loaded and their Marines preparing for what would become one of the most controversial military interventions in American history. The pre-dawn darkness of April 21, 1914, was pierced by the urgent clatter of signal lamps flashing between American warships anchored off Veracruz. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding the Atlantic Fleet's 2nd Division, stood on the bridge of his flagship USS Florida, studying the Mexican coastline through his binoculars. The 60-year-old admiral had earned his reputation during the Spanish-American War and now faced perhaps the most challenging assignment of his distinguished career. Fletcher's orders from Washington were clear but daunting. Seize the customs house at Veracruz and prevent the landing of arms from the German steamer Ipiranga. Intelligence reports indicated that the ship carried 15 million cartridges and artillery pieces that would significantly bolster General Huerta's federal forces. The mission required speed, precision, and overwhelming force to minimize casualties on both sides. The American flotilla arrayed in Veracruz harbor represented the finest naval power of the era. Alongside Fletcher's flagship Florida rode the battleship Utah, the armored cruiser San Francisco, and the gunboats Chester and Prairie, most crucially for the coming operation. The transport ships carried 800 Marines from the 2nd Regiment, commanded by Colonel Wendell Neville, a veteran of the Boxer Rebellion, who had earned the Medal of Honor for his courage under fire in China. As dawn approached, Fletcher convened his senior officers in the Florida's wardroom. The electric lights cast harsh shadows on their weathered faces as they pored over detailed maps of Veracruz. The Mexican port city was no easy target. Its narrow streets and colonial architecture provided countless defensive positions, while the massive fortress of San Juan commanded the harbor approaches with its ancient but still formidable cannons. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Neville outlined the assault plan with military precision. The Naval Academy at Annapolis, according to a detailed analysis published in the Army and Navy Journal, had trained these officers to expect fierce resistance from well-entrenched defenders. The Marines would land in 3 waves, the first to secure the waterfront and customs house, second to establish a perimeter around the American consulate, and the third to hold strategic buildings throughout the city center. Intelligence gathered by American consular officials painted a complex picture of the opposition they would face. Mexican federal forces in Veracruz numbered approximately 1,000 men under General Gustavo Mas, competent commander who had fortified key positions throughout the city. More concerning were reports of civilian volunteers, stirred to patriotic fervor by calls to resist the American invasion, who were organizing irregular units armed with whatever weapons they could find. The American naval officers understood that urban warfare presented unique challenges far different from conventional ship-to-ship combat. The narrow streets of Veracruz's colonial center could channel attacking forces into deadly crossfires, while the flat rooftops provided excellent sniper positions for determined defenders. Moreover, the presence of foreign nationals, including substantial German, British, and Spanish communities, complicated rules of engagement and increased the risk of international incidents. As the sun climbed higher, Fletcher received final confirmation from Washington. President Wilson had authorized the operation to commence immediately. The admiral's weathered hand steady as he raised his signal flags, knowing that his next command would likely result in the first major combat action by American forces since the Spanish-American War 16 years earlier. Below decks, Marines checked their Springfield rifles and fixed bayonets with the methodical precision drilled into them through countless hours of training. Many were young men from farms and small towns across America, drawn to military service by promises of adventure and steady pay. Few had imagined they would soon be fighting house to house in an ancient Mexican port city. Facing an enemy defending their homeland against foreign invasion, the moment of decision arrived at 11:45 in the morning, when Fletcher's signal lamp began flashing the attack order to his fleet. Steam-powered launches immediately lowered from the warships, their decks packed with Marines in field gear. Officers consulting pocket watches as they coordinated the precise timing of their assault. The Battle of Veracruz was about to begin, and with it, a new chapter in the turbulent relationship between the United States and Mexico. At precisely 12:15 on April 21, 1914, the first wave of American Marines splashed ashore at Veracruz under a brilliant Mexican sun. The ancient stone seawalls that had protected the port for centuries now witnessed another foreign invasion. As blue-clad Marines charged across the sandy beaches with rifles held high above the surf, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Neville led the assault personally. His boots hitting the beach as enemy rifle fire began crackling from the customs house windows. The imposing stone building, constructed during the colonial era to process the wealth of New Spain, had been converted into a fortress by Mexican federal troops, who recognized its strategic importance to controlling the port. The first Marine casualties fell within minutes of landing. Private First Class Samuel Gross from Ohio clutched his shoulder as a Mexican sniper's bullet found its mark, but continued advancing with his squad toward the designated objective. The disciplined fire of Springfield rifles answered the Mexican Mauser rounds, creating a deadly symphony that echoed off the colonial buildings surrounding the harbor. Captain Edward Orick's company moved with practiced precision toward the railroad terminal. Following tactics perfected during training exercises at Marine Corps Base Quantico, the young captain, a graduate of Virginia Military Institute, had studied urban warfare extensively, but found that textbook knowledge provided little comfort when facing live ammunition in the narrow confines of Veracruz's commercial district. Mexican resistance proved more determined than American intelligence had predicted. General Gustavo Maz had positioned his federal troops with tactical skill, utilizing the thick-walled buildings and elevated positions to maximum advantage. From the fortress of San Juan de artillery pieces that had defended Spanish treasure fleets now turned their fire against American landing craft, sending geysers of water skyward as shells narrowly missed their targets. The Customs House battle became a brutal room-term fight that lasted 3 hours. Marines used hand grenades to clear Mexican positions. While federal soldiers fought desperately to hold ground, they considered sacred national territory. According to contemporary accounts published in Harper's Weekly, the ferocity of close-quarters combat shocked even veteran military correspondents who had covered conflicts across the globe. By mid-afternoon, American reinforcements were streaming ashore, as Admiral Fletcher committed his reserves to expanding the beachhead. Sailors from the battleships joined the fight, their naval training rapidly adapting to land warfare as they supported Marine advances through the commercial quarter. The combined force now numbered over 1,000 men, giving the Americans decisive numerical superiority in most engagements. The Mexican federal troops, though outnumbered and outgunned, continued fighting with remarkable courage. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel led a counterattack against Marine positions near the Veracruz railway station, his men advancing across open ground despite devastating rifle fire that cut down soldiers with each step forward. The assault ultimately failed. But the bravery displayed by Mexican forces earned grudging respect from their American opponents. Civilian resistance complicated the urban battles significantly. Armed citizens, motivated by patriotic fury at the foreign invasion, established sniper positions in church bell towers and private residences throughout the Old City. These irregular fighters lacked military training but possessed intimate knowledge of Veracruz's maze-like streets, allowing them to conduct effective guerrilla operations against American patrols. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as both sides struggled to control key intersections and strategic buildings. Marines advancing along the Calle de la Independencia encountered fierce resistance at every corner, while Mexican defenders utilized the thick stone construction of colonial architecture to create nearly impregnable positions that required careful coordination to overcome. Medical corpsmen on both sides worked frantically to treat the mounting casualties. American field hospitals established in captured buildings provided emergency treatment for wounded Marines, while Mexican doctors and improvised aid stations treated their own soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. The universal nature of human suffering transcended national boundaries as medical personnel focused solely on saving lives regardless of uniform color. As evening approached, American forces controlled approximately half the city, including the vital customs house and major government buildings. However, Mexican resistance showed no signs of weakening. An intelligence report suggested that reinforcements from the interior were marching toward Veracruz to reinforce the defenders. The Battle of Veracruz had evolved from a limited operation into a full-scale urban warfare campaign that would test American military doctrine and resolve. Dawn on April 22nd brought no respite to the exhausted combatants locked in desperate street fighting throughout Veracruz. The narrow cobblestone streets, designed for ox carts in the colonial era, had become deadly corridors where Marines advanced building by building against determined Mexican defenders who knew every doorway and rooftop in their ancient city. Captain Smedley Butler, the legendary Marine officer who would later earn 2 Medals of Honor, led his company in a frontal assault on the Mexican stronghold surrounding the Veracruz Cathedral. The imposing stone structure, built by Spanish colonists 3 centuries earlier, commanded the central plaza and provided Mexican federal troops with an elevated position from which to rain devastating fire on American advances. The fighting had taken on a personal character that transcended military objectives. Mexican Colonel Azueta, commanding federal forces in the Cathedral District, had transformed the sacred building into a fortress, positioning riflemen behind ancient stone buttresses and artillery pieces in the bell tower. His men fought with the desperate courage of soldiers defending their homeland against foreign invaders, each Mexican casualty representing not just a military loss, but a personal tragedy for families throughout the port city. American Marines, meanwhile, adapted their tactics to the unique challenges of urban warfare with characteristic improvisation. Sergeant Major John Quick, a Spanish-American war veteran, pioneered the use of concentrated rifle fire to suppress Mexican snipers, before advancing across open plazas. His innovative tactics, later documented in Marine Corps training manuals, saved countless American lives during the brutal house-to-house fighting that characterized the Battle of Veracruz. The civilian population found itself trapped between opposing forces as the battle raged through residential neighborhoods. According to detailed reports published in the Mexican newspaper, El Impartial, families huddled in basement shelters while bullets shattered windows, and artillery shells collapsed roofs above their heads. Foreign nationals, including substantial German and Spanish communities, sought refuge in their respective consulates while diplomats frantically negotiated safe passage for non-combatants. Mexican resistance reached its peak when Captain Azueta, son of the federal colonel defending the cathedral, made a daring counterattack against Marine positions near the main plaza. The young officer, educated at Mexico's National Military Academy, understood that American forces could be disrupted by aggressive tactics that prevented them from utilizing their superior firepower and numerical advantages. The counterattack initially succeeded in pushing Marines back from key intersections. But American reinforcements quickly arrived to stabilize the situation. Naval gunfire from offshore warships provided devastating support, with 5-inch shells from USS Prairie demolishing Mexican strongpoints that had withstood hours of rifle fire. The thunderous bombardment shook the ancient city to its foundations, sending clouds of dust and debris skyward as colonial buildings collapsed under modern naval artillery. Individual acts of heroism on both sides elevated the battle beyond mere tactical maneuvering. Private First Class Ralph Talbot earned the Medal of Honor by single-handedly capturing a Mexican machine gun position that had pinned down his entire platoon, while Mexican Lieutenant Francisco Garcia died defending the customs warehouse with only a pistol and handful of loyal soldiers. The medical crisis deepened as casualties mounted on both sides. American field surgeons, working in converted commercial buildings, treated Marines wounded by Mexican Mauser bullets that caused devastating injuries at close range. Mexican doctors, lacking adequate medical supplies due to the American blockade, performed amputations and emergency surgery with improvised instruments, while artillery shells exploded in nearby streets. Intelligence reports reached Admiral Fletcher indicating that General Maz was organizing a final desperate assault to recapture the customs house and drive American forces back to their ships. Mexican reinforcements from inland garrisons were reportedly marching toward Veracruz, potentially doubling the defenders' strength and prolonging the urban battle indefinitely. The psychological toll of street fighting affected soldiers on both sides as the second day of combat drew to a close. Marines who had expected a brief police action found themselves engaged in the most intense urban warfare since the Civil War, while Mexican defenders realized that their antiquated weapons and limited ammunition could not indefinitely hold back the modern American military machine. As darkness fell over Veracruz on April 22nd, both armies prepared for what many believed would be the decisive day of battle. The ancient port city, which had witnessed conquistadors and pirates throughout its turbulent history, now trembled under the impact of 20th-century warfare that would determine whether Mexico could resist American intervention or succumb to foreign occupation. The pre-dawn stillness of April 23, 1914, shattered as USS Florida's main batteries opened fire on Mexican positions throughout Veracruz. The thunderous roar of attention naval guns echoed across the Gulf of Mexico, announcing the beginning of what would prove to be the decisive phase of the American assault on the ancient Mexican port. Admiral Fletcher had reluctantly authorized the naval bombardment after receiving intelligence that General Maz was massing federal troops for a coordinated counterattack designed to drive the Marines back into the sea. The admiral understood that heavy artillery fire would inevitably cause civilian casualties, but military necessity demanded that Mexican strongpoints be neutralized before they could launch their desperate offensive. The fortress of San Juan, de which had guarded Veracruz harbor since the 16th century, bore the brunt of the American naval assault. The ancient stone walls, built to withstand cannonballs from Spanish galleons, crumbled under the impact of modern high-explosive shells that created massive breaches in fortifications that had stood for centuries. Mexican artillery crews manning obsolete cannon fought bravely to return fire, but their weapons were hopelessly outclassed by American naval gunnery. Colonel Wendell Neville coordinated the Marine ground assault to coincide with the naval bombardment. launching simultaneous attacks against Mexican positions throughout the city center. His Marines advanced behind a rolling barrage that systematically destroyed enemy strongpoints, allowing American infantry to occupy buildings that had been impregnable just hours earlier. The Cathedral District, where Mexican Colonel Asueda had established his command post, became the focal point of the final American offensive. Marine Captain Smedley Butler led his company in a frontal assault across the main plaza, while naval shells exploded around the ancient stone structure that had become the symbol of Mexican resistance to foreign occupation. Mexican federal troops, despite being overwhelmed by superior American firepower, continued fighting with remarkable determination. Lieutenant Colonel Miguel organized a series of delaying actions that forced Marines to fight for every street corner and building entrance, extracting maximum casualties from the advancing Americans, even as his own forces dwindled under constant artillery fire. The civilian population of Veracruz found itself caught in an increasingly desperate situation. As the naval bombardment intensified, according to contemporary accounts published in the London Times, families trapped in the combat zone faced the terrible choice between remaining in collapsing buildings or risking their lives crossing streets swept by rifle fire and shell fragments. Captain Asueda, the young Mexican officer who had led the previous day's counterattack, fell mortally wounded while directing the defense of a strategic intersection near the customs house. His death became a rallying cry for Mexican defenders, who intensified their resistance. Despite facing impossible odds against American naval and ground forces, the turning point came when American forces captured the main telegraph office, cutting Mexican communications with the interior and preventing General Maz from coordinating with federal reinforcements reportedly marching toward Veracruz. This tactical victory isolated the Mexican garrison and made continued resistance essentially futile. Though individual federal units continued fighting from fortified positions throughout the Old City, naval gunfire proved devastatingly effective against Mexican artillery positions that had dominated key intersections for 2 days. The ancient fortress guns that had held American Marines at bay were systematically destroyed by precise naval gunnery directed by observers, positioned in captured buildings overlooking the harbor. Medical personnel on both sides worked frantically to treat casualties as the battle reached its climax. American hospital ships offshore received a steady stream of wounded Marines evacuated from the urban battlefield, while Mexican doctors and improvised field hospitals treated their own wounded with rapidly diminishing medical supplies. The psychological impact of the naval bombardment began breaking Mexican resistance as federal soldiers realized that their obsolete weapons could not compete with modern American firepower. Desertion rates increased dramatically as Mexican troops slipped away from their positions under cover of darkness, leaving their officers to continue hopeless resistance with steadily diminishing forces. By late afternoon on April 23rd, American forces controlled 3/4 of Veracruz, including all major government buildings and strategic positions. Mexican resistance, while still fierce in isolated pockets, could no longer mount coordinated defensive operations that might reverse American gains or threaten the security of forces already ashore. As sunset approached, Admiral Fletcher prepared orders for the final assault that would complete American occupation of Veracruz. The ancient Mexican port, which had defied foreign invaders for over 400 years, was about to fall under American control in what would become one of the most controversial military interventions in United States history. The morning of April 24th, 1914, dawned over a Veracruz transformed by 3 days of intense urban warfare. American flags now flew from the Customs House, City Hall, and the Fortress of San Juan, marking the complete occupation of Mexico's most important Gulf port by United States military forces. General Gustavo Maz, the Mexican federal commander who had organized the city's defense, formally surrendered his remaining forces to Colonel Wendell Neville in a brief ceremony held in the main plaza. The proud Mexican general, his uniform torn and dusty from days of street fighting, maintained his dignity even in defeat. As he handed over his sword to the American Marine officer who had led the successful assault, the human cost of the Battle of Veracruz became apparent as casualty reports reached both governments. American forces had suffered 19 killed and 71 wounded, losses that shocked a nation unprepared for significant military casualties in what had been portrayed as a limited police action. Mexican casualties proved more difficult to determine precisely, but estimates suggested at least 200 dead and several hundred wounded among both military personnel and civilians caught in the crossfire. Admiral Fletcher immediately established military government over Veracruz, appointing American officers to administer essential city services while attempting to restore normal civilian life. The occupation forces faced the complex challenge of governing a hostile population while maintaining military security against potential guerrilla attacks by Mexican patriots who refused to accept foreign rule. The International Red Cross, according to reports published in the Geneva Medical Journal, dispatched emergency medical supplies and personnel to treat wounded civilians and prisoners of war on both sides. American military doctors worked alongside Mexican physicians to establish field hospitals capable of handling the most severe casualties, demonstrating humanitarian cooperation despite the political tensions surrounding the occupation. Mexican federal troops who had fought so courageously during the siege were granted honorable treatment as prisoners of war, with American authorities providing adequate food, medical care, and shelter in accordance with international law. Many Mexican soldiers expressed surprise at the respectful treatment they received from their former enemies, contrasting sharply with the brutal conduct they had experienced in Mexico's ongoing civil war. The civilian population of Veracruz responded to occupation with a mixture of resignation and sullen resentment. While most citizens avoided overt resistance that might provoke American retaliation, the atmosphere remained tense as Mexican patriots organized peaceful demonstrations, protesting foreign occupation of their sovereign territory. Economic life in Veracruz ground to a virtual halt as the American blockade prevented normal commercial shipping, while military authorities struggled to restore basic services disrupted by the fighting. The port facilities, crucial to Mexico's international trade, remained under strict American control as Fletcher's forces prepared defensive positions against potential counterattacks from federal reinforcements. President Wilson faced mounting criticism from both domestic and international sources as news of the occupation spread worldwide. Latin American governments unanimously condemned the American intervention as a violation of Mexican sovereignty, while European powers questioned whether the United States was prepared to assume the responsibilities of governing foreign territory indefinitely. The German merchant vessel Ipiranga, whose cargo of arms and ammunition had precipitated the crisis, was forced to anchor outside territorial waters as American warships maintained strict enforcement of the weapons embargo. The incident highlighted the broader international dimensions of the Mexican Revolution and the complex web of foreign interests involved in the conflict. Reconstruction efforts began immediately as American engineers assessed damage to the city's infrastructure caused by 3 days of urban warfare. The ancient stone buildings of colonial Veracruz had proven remarkably resistant to rifle fire, but naval bombardment had created significant damage to public buildings and residential areas throughout the combat zone. Religious authorities on both sides worked to minimize sectarian tensions that might complicate the occupation. Catholic clergy in Veracruz, while privately opposing foreign occupation, publicly urged their parishioners to avoid violence that might result in further civilian casualties and property destruction. The strategic implications of the American victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Control of Veracruz gave United States forces the ability to influence the course of Mexico's civil war by controlling arms, shipments, and customs revenues that all Mexican factions desperately needed to continue fighting. As April 24th drew to a close, American authorities began implementing long-term occupation policies designed to maintain order while avoiding the appearance of permanent territorial acquisition. The Battle of Veracruz was over, but its political and diplomatic consequences would reverberate throughout the hemisphere for years to come, fundamentally altering the relationship between the United States and Mexico in ways that neither government had anticipated when the crisis began. 2 weeks earlier, 7 months after the guns fell silent in Veracruz, American forces began their withdrawal from the ancient Mexican port on November 23, 1914. The stars and stripes came down from government buildings throughout the city as Mexican federal troops, now loyal to the constitutionalist government of Venustiano Carranza, prepared to resume control of their nation's most important Gulf Coast facility. The long occupation had profoundly changed both Veracruz and American foreign policy in ways that contemporary observers struggle to comprehend fully. What began as a limited intervention to secure an apology for the Tampico incident had evolved into a prolonged military occupation that cost both nations far more than anticipated in blood, treasure, and international prestige. President Woodrow Wilson, reflecting on the intervention during a cabinet meeting in December 1914, privately acknowledged that the operation had achieved its immediate military objectives while failing catastrophically in its broader diplomatic goals. Rather than stabilizing Mexico and promoting democratic government, American intervention had intensified anti-American sentiment throughout Latin America and complicated Wilson's efforts to pursue moral diplomacy based on respect for national sovereignty. The casualty figures, while modest by later 20th century standards, shocked an American public unprepared for significant military losses in what many had assumed would be a bloodless police action. The 19 American deaths and 71 wounded represented the first substantial combat casualties suffered by United States forces since the Spanish-American War, foreshadowing the much larger sacrifices that would be demanded during the approaching World War. Mexican losses proved more difficult to calculate precisely, but conservative estimates suggested at least 200 military and civilian deaths during the three-day battle, with several hundred additional wounded who required extensive medical treatment. According to detailed reports published in the Mexico City newspaper El Universal, the human cost of foreign occupation weighed heavily on Mexican national consciousness and contributed to enduring suspicion of American intentions in the region. The economic impact of the occupation extended far beyond immediate military expenditures. American control of Veracruz customs revenues deprived all Mexican factions of crucial funding needed to continue their civil war, inadvertently prolonging the internal conflict that Washington had hoped to resolve through decisive intervention. International reaction to the American occupation proved uniformly negative throughout Latin America, where governments viewed the intervention as confirmation of United States imperial ambitions in the Western Hemisphere. The ABC powers Argentina, Brazil, and Chile offered to mediate the dispute, leading to negotiations in Niagara Falls that ultimately proved ineffective in resolving underlying tensions between the two nations. Military lessons learned during the Battle of Veracruz influenced American tactical doctrine for decades afterward. The Marine Corps incorporated urban warfare techniques, developed during street fighting in Veracruz, into training programs that proved invaluable during later interventions in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic throughout the 1920s and 30s. The individual heroes of both sides became symbols of their respective nations' values and military traditions. Captain Asueta, the young Mexican officer killed defending his homeland, was posthumously promoted and honored as a national martyr whose sacrifice embodied Mexican resistance to foreign domination. Got American Medal of Honor recipients from the battle, including Smedley Butler and John McCloy, became legendary figures in Marine Corps history and examples of courage under fire. Technological innovations tested during the Veracruz operation influenced subsequent military developments, particularly in naval gunnery and amphibious assault techniques. The successful coordination between naval bombardment and marine ground operations provided valuable experience that proved crucial during later Pacific campaigns of World War II. The diplomatic legacy of the intervention cast a long shadow over United States-Mexico relations well into the 20th century. Mexican political leaders across the ideological spectrum cited the occupation as evidence of American imperial intentions, complicating bilateral negotiations on trade, immigration, and security issues for generations. Wilson's decision to intervene militarily in Mexico marked a turning point in American foreign policy, demonstrating the practical limitations of moral diplomacy when confronted with complex international crises. The president's subsequent reluctance to use military force abroad reflected hard-earned wisdom about the unintended consequences of well-intentioned interventions. The Battle of Veracruz thus stands as a pivotal moment in hemispheric history, illustrating both the capabilities and limitations of American military power while highlighting the enduring tensions between national sovereignty and international order that continue to shape global politics into the 21st century. The ancient Mexican port, which had witnessed Spanish conquistadors, French interventions, and American occupation, remained a symbol of Mexico's complex relationship with foreign powers and its determination to maintain independence despite overwhelming odds.